Vixara ducked her head as she entered the community hall, a reflex developed over 23 cycles of existence. Even with this habitual gesture, her crest still brushed against the doorframe. The vibrant purple filaments that crowned her head flattened in embarrassment as several Thelorisians turned to stare, their own crests barely reaching the height of her shoulders. "The tower walks among us," someone whispered, loud enough for her sensitive auditory canals to catch. Vixara's outer eyelids twitched, but she maintained her composure, moving to the farthest corner of the room where a service terminal stood unoccupied. Unlike the golden-skinned Thelorisians with their compact builds and delicate features, Vixara's azure complexion and towering 8-foot frame marked her as different. The anthropologists claimed she was descended from the Azurans, a neighboring species believed extinct after the Great Celestial Storm 3 centuries ago. A foundling, they called her. A genetic anomaly. A curiosity. To Vixara, none of those scholarly designations mattered. She was simply alone. "Attention, citizens of Artaxis District," announced Chief Administrator Pelnor from the central platform. His crest flared with official importance as his amplified voice rippled through the hall. "As you've all been notified, representatives from the planet called Earth have established diplomatic contact. Their delegation will arrive at our community center today to begin cultural exchange." The crowd's collective crest filaments quivered with excitement. First contact with an alien species was momentous, even for a spacefaring society like theirs. Vixara felt a flutter of curiosity beneath her professional detachment. Perhaps these humans would be different, taller, like her. She returned to her work terminal, inputting maintenance schedules for the district's atmospheric regulators. As the community's environmental engineer, she at least had purpose, even if she lacked belonging. The systems required constant adjustment due to Thalaris's unpredictable climate shifts, and few had the reach or strength to access the higher components without mechanical assistance. 3 hours later, a commotion at the entrance drew her attention. The humans had arrived. Vixara's heart sank as the delegation entered. They were shorter than average Thelorisians, most barely reaching 5.5 feet. All except one, a male with rich brown skin and close-cropped dark hair who stood nearly 6 feet tall. Still considerably shorter than her, but the tallest in the room besides herself. The humans wore environmental suits with transparent helmets, their faces clearly visible as they gazed around with undisguised wonder. The taller human's eyes met hers across the room, and something unexpected happened. He smiled directly at her. Not a smile of mockery or fascination with her strangeness, but a simple acknowledgement between two people who stood out from the crowd. Chief Pelnor led the formal introductions, reciting the humans' names and titles with careful pronunciation. Vixara half-listened until the tall human was introduced. Engineer Marcus Reed, Environmental Systems Specialist, translated the adaptive communication device. The human, Marcus, nodded respectfully to the assembly, then let his gaze wander back to Vixara. Later, as the formal ceremony concluded and the minglers broke into conversation groups, Vixara remained at her terminal, pretending to work while watching the proceedings from her corner. She flinched when a voice spoke directly behind her. "Your atmospheric regulation systems are fascinating. Adaptive algorithms based on weather patterns?" She turned to find Marcus Reed standing there, helmet removed now that compatibility tests had cleared the air, looking up at her with genuine interest in his deep brown eyes. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "How did you know?" He gestured to her screen. "I recognize coding architecture when I see it, though your symbols are new to me. I'm guessing you're the engineer in charge? The maintenance access points I saw on our way in would require someone with your reach." For the first time in her memory, someone was seeing her height as an advantage rather than an aberration. The filaments of her crest lifted slightly, her species' subtle indication of pleasure. "I am Vixara, environmental engineer for Artaxis District," she said, straightening to her full height rather than hunching as usual. "And yes, I designed the current system." Marcus smiled again, warm and appreciative. I'd love to learn more about it, if you're willing to teach me. On Earth, we have diverse climates too, but nothing requiring this level of intervention. As conversation flowed between them, technical at first but gradually more personal, Vixara felt something unfamiliar unfurling inside her chest, hope. Perhaps this human visitor might see beyond her stature to the person within. The maintenance bay hummed with the sound of atmospheric regulators as Vixara's long fingers deftly adjusted the calibration node. Marcus watched from beside her, fascinated by the elegant efficiency of her movements. 2 weeks had passed since the human delegation's arrival, and he had requested to be paired with Vixara for the technical aspects of their mission. The harmonics are balanced now, she said, her melodic voice carrying in the cavernous space. This should prevent the pressure fluctuations you experienced in your quarters. Thanks, Marcus replied, handing her a specialized tool before she even needed to ask. They had developed a comfortable rhythm working together. Earth's atmospheric systems are much cruder by comparison. We're still adapting to single environments rather than creating adaptive ones. Vixara's crest rippled with interest, the purple filaments catching the light. Marcus had learned this was her equivalent of a smile, one rarely seen by others in her community. Your world has oceans, she said wistfully. I've only seen water bodies that large in simulations. Marcus pulled out his personal device, scrolling to an image of the Pacific Ocean from his hometown in California. This was the view from my residence. The sunset over water creates colors similar to your crest. Vixara leaned down to see, her height casting a shadow over him. Unlike the Thelorisians who always maintained a careful distance from her, Marcus never seemed bothered by her towering presence. Beautiful, she breathed, then straightened abruptly as the maintenance bay doors slid open. A group of Thelarian technicians entered, their golden skin gleaming under the lights. Their crests flattened immediately upon seeing Vixara, and they huddled together, whispering. The Azurite giant has captured a human, one murmured, loud enough to carry. Marcus frowned. Do they think we can't hear them? They know I can, Vixara replied quietly. That's partially the point. Before Marcus could respond, he stepped forward. Actually, I've captured her, if anyone's keeping score. Engineer Vixara has been generous enough to share her expertise, which will be prominently featured in my report to Earth's Scientific Council. The technicians' crests flattened further in embarrassment as they hurried to the far side of the bay. Marcus turned back to Vixara, whose crest was now fully extended in surprise. You didn't need to do that, she said. I stated facts. You're the most knowledgeable engineer I've met on the Laris. He paused, then added more softly, tell me about your ancestry, if you don't mind. You mentioned being a foundling? Vixara hesitated, then nodded. I was discovered as an infant after the third atmospheric disturbance, 23 cycles ago. The anthropologists believe I'm descended from Azurans, a neighboring species believed extinct after the Great Celestial Storm. There are no records of their culture that survived. So you've never known others like yourself? No. The Thelorisians raised me adequately, but... She trailed off, closing the maintenance panel with more force than necessary. But you've always been alone in a crowd, Marcus finished for her. Her eyes, larger and deeper blue than any Thelarian's, widened slightly. Yes. Exactly that. Later that evening, they sat in the research archives, Marcus helping Vixara access Earth's xenobiological database. His delegation had brought comprehensive cultural and scientific records as a gesture of goodwill. Look, he said, pointing to an entry. There was an Earth expedition to a system near here 30 years ago. They documented a civilization with similar characteristics to what you've described as Azuran. Vixara leaned closer, her crest fully extended in excitement. The height, the azure pigmentation, it matches. And these structures. Her voice caught. They look like the patterns I draw when I'm alone. Marcus watched as she scrolled through images, recognition flashing in her eyes. For the first time, she was seeing evidence that she wasn't merely an anomaly, she was part of something. The database says they valued height as a sign of wisdom, Marcus noted. Leaders were chosen partly based on stature. A small sound escaped Vixara, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. On a world where I would have been revered, I instead grew up being told to make myself smaller. Marcus gently touched her arm, the first time he had initiated physical contact. Sometimes we need to see ourselves through different eyes to understand our true worth. In that moment, something shifted between them. Vixara didn't pull away from his touch, and as their eyes met, Marcus felt a connection that transcended their biological differences. "Tomorrow," he said, making a sudden decision, "I'd like to show you something from my culture. Would you join me for a meal in my quarters? Earth-style?" Vixara's crest fluttered with what he now recognized as happiness. "I would be honored," she replied, unaware that on the Laris, an invitation to share a private, home-prepared meal carried significant cultural implications, ones that would soon complicate their growing friendship in ways neither could anticipate. Marcus's quarters hummed with unfamiliar scents as he carefully arranged the makeshift dining area. He had spent his personal recreation credits to acquire local ingredients that approximated Earth flavors, working with the nutritional compatibility data to ensure everything would be safe for Vixara's consumption. The small preparation unit glowed as he removed his final creation, a dish resembling pasta with a sauce of vibrant purple vegetables that reminded him of Vixara's crest. The human delegation's quarters were designed for Thalarian proportions, making everything slightly too small for him. For Vixara, it would be even more cramped, but he had arranged the furniture to maximize space for her. A soft chime announced her arrival. When the door slid open, Marcus momentarily lost his composure. Vixara stood before him, her azure skin adorned with delicate patterns of silver that caught the light. She had replaced her utilitarian work clothing with flowing garments that emphasized rather than concealed her height. "You look." He searched for the right word, magnificent. Vixara's crest rippled with pleasure, though she ducked slightly to enter the room, a habitual gesture that Marcus wished she didn't need to make. "I've never been invited to a personal dwelling before," she admitted, surveying the space with curious eyes. "The patterns you've created with the food, they're intentional?" Marcus nodded, pulling out a reinforced chair he had specially requested. "On Earth, presentation is part of the dining experience. Please, sit." As they settled at the small table, Marcus described each dish and its Earth equivalent. Vixara listened intently, her large eyes reflecting the room's ambient lighting as she carefully mimicked his use of utensils rather than the scooping tools Thalarians typically used. "This is remarkable," she said after tasting the main dish. "The textures complement each other in ways our food rarely does. It's a poor approximation of Earth cuisine, but I wanted to share something authentic with you," Marcus replied, enjoying how her crest fluctuated with each new flavor discovery. Their conversation flowed easily, moving from culinary differences to personal histories. Marcus told her about growing up near the ocean, his decision to become an engineer, and his fascination with alien environments that had ultimately brought him to the Laris. "You speak of your differences from others as strengths," Vixara observed. "On Earth, is variation celebrated?" Marcus considered this. "Not always, historically. But we've learned that diversity, in thought, in appearance, in ability, makes us stronger as a species. Some of our greatest innovations came from those who saw the world differently. A civilization that values difference," she mused, a wistful tone in her melodic voice. "I would like to see such a place." As they finished the meal, Marcus retrieved a small container. "On Earth, we have a tradition of something sweet to end the meal. I hope you'll like it." The dessert, a gel-like substance infused with local berries, brought a sound from Vixara that Marcus hadn't heard before, a melodic laugh of pure delight. "This is wonderful," she exclaimed, her usual reserve momentarily forgotten. Marcus smiled, watching her enjoyment with a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the synthetic wine equivalent they had shared. Their evening was interrupted by an urgent knock. Before Marcus could respond, the door slid open to reveal Jorith, the Thalarian cultural liaison, his golden skin flushed darker with agitation. "Engineer Vixara," he said, his crest completely flat against his head, "you have initiated a binding ceremony without proper documentation or familial representation." Vixara froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "What?" Jorith gestured frantically at the elaborate meal spread between them. "A private, home-prepared nutritional sharing is the first step in our bonding rituals. The community is buzzing with news that you have proposed union with the human." Marcus set down his glass carefully. "There's been a misunderstanding. On Earth, sharing meals is a common social activity without any binding implications." "This is not Earth," Jorith said stiffly. "And while Engineer Vixara may be physically anomalous, she is subject to our cultural protocols." Vixara stood suddenly, her height imposing in the small room. "I was raised in your culture, Liaison Jorith, but have never been fully accepted within it. Neither Engineer Reed nor I intended any ceremonial significance. Nevertheless, the ritual has been observed and acknowledged. You must either formally register your intent to bond or submit a ceremonial rejection." Joritha's eyes darted between them. "The High Council requests your presence tomorrow morning." After he departed, a heavy silence fell between them. Marcus stood up, moving closer to Vixara, whose crest now hung limply. "I'm sorry," they both said simultaneously, then laughed nervously. "I should have researched your customs more thoroughly," Marcus said. Vixara shook her head. "No one would have expected you to know. Private meals are rare on the Laris because of their significance." "I should have realized." Marcus hesitated, then took her hand, her long, elegant fingers cool against his palm. "For what it's worth, if I were to propose a union on any world, would be honored to do so with someone as extraordinary as you." The filaments of Vixara's crest lifted slightly, a blush of deeper blue spreading across her cheeks. "Even though I tower over you? Even though I'm different?" "Especially because you're different," Marcus replied softly. "Just as I am different here. Perhaps that's why we understand each other." In that moment, with cultural misunderstandings hovering over them and an uncertain meeting with the High Council looming, they found themselves drawing closer, two outsiders creating their own small world of belonging amid the stars. The High Council chamber loomed vast and imposing, its arched ceiling adorned with constellations mapping Thalaris's position in the galaxy. Vixara stood beside Marcus before the semicircle of counselors, their golden skin gleaming in the chamber's soft light. Even here, in this space designed to accommodate dignitaries of various species, she felt conspicuously oversized. "The situation is unprecedented," announced Chief Counselor Neville, her crest perfectly maintained in the formal arrangement denoting authority. "A nutritional bonding ritual between a Thalarian citizen and an off-worlder requires special consideration." Marcus stepped forward. "Counselors, the shared meal carried no ceremonial intent. On Earth, dining together is simply a way to build friendship and understanding. Intent is irrelevant once the ritual has begun," countered Counselor Zeth, the oldest member whose crest had faded to pale lavender with age. "Our traditions are absolute." Vixara felt a familiar heaviness settle in her chest, the weight of rules that never accounted for her existence. But something had changed within her since meeting Marcus. The constant need to apologize for her presence had diminished. "Respectfully, counselors," she said, straightening to her full 8-foot height rather than the hunched posture she typically adopted in official settings, "if our traditions are indeed absolute, then you must acknowledge that I have never been fully included in them. I've been classified as both Thalarian and not Thalarian whenever convenient for societal comfort." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Marcus glanced up at her, pride evident in his expression. Furthermore, she continued, her voice growing stronger, Engineer Reed represents Earth in a diplomatic capacity. Forcing him to adhere to a ritual binding he did not knowingly enter would violate the terms of our interplanetary agreement. The delegation leader, Commander Whitfield, who had been summoned to the proceedings, nodded in agreement. We came seeking cultural exchange, not to disrupt your social structures. Perhaps this misunderstanding can become an opportunity for deeper understanding between our worlds. After hours of deliberation, the council reached a compromise. The ritual would be officially recorded as a cultural exchange ceremony rather than a bonding initiation. Neither Vixara nor Marcus would face social penalties, but they were cautioned about further private interactions that might be misinterpreted. As they left the chamber, Vixara sensed the stares following them, some curious, others disapproving. The news had spread quickly through the community. You were magnificent in there, Marcus said quietly as they walked across the central plaza. Standing tall suits you. Before she could respond, a group of younger Thelarians approached, their crests bristling with agitation. Is it true you're abandoning our ways for alien customs? One demanded, positioning himself aggressively in front of Marcus. Step aside, Vixara said, her voice level. The Azurite giant chooses outsiders over her own kind, another jeered. Though you never were truly one of us, were you? Marcus stepped forward. We're all outsiders somewhere. The difference is how we treat those who don't look like us. The tension might have escalated further had Commander Whitfield not appeared with several Thelarian security officers. The group dispersed, but their hostile glares lingered. The delegation has received several concerning messages, Whitfield informed them. Some factions are using your situation as propaganda against our presence here. That evening, Vixara accompanied Marcus to the environmental monitoring station outside the settlement. They had legitimate work reasons to be there together, checking atmospheric readings, work that conveniently took them away from judgmental eyes. As the twin moons of the Laris rose, casting silver light across the monitoring equipment, Vixara found herself speaking about things she'd never shared before. I used to come here alone to watch the stars, she admitted. I would imagine worlds where everyone was my size, where I wouldn't need to duck through doorways or hear whispers as I passed. Marcus moved closer, the warmth of his presence comforting in the cool night air. Earth has people of many heights, though admittedly none quite as magnificently tall as you. But there would be doorways you could walk through without ducking, clothes designed for your proportions, and people who would see your height as beautiful rather than strange. Beautiful, she echoed, the word feeling foreign on her tongue when applied to herself. Yes, Marcus said simply, reaching up to touch her face with gentle fingers. Absolutely beautiful. The moment was shattered by a shout and the sound of running footsteps. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, faces obscured but clearly Thelarian from their builds. Species traitor, one called out, hurling an object that narrowly missed Vixara's head and shattered against the monitoring equipment. What happened next occurred too quickly for conscious thought. As one attacker lunged toward Marcus with something gleaming in his hand, Vixara moved with instinctive speed, her larger frame and longer reach allowing her to intercept the assailant. With strength she had always tried to minimize, she lifted the attacker bodily and tossed him away from Marcus. The other 2 hesitated, then fled into the darkness with their companion. Are you hurt? She asked frantically, turning to Marcus who stood with shock evident on his face. I'm fine, he assured her, then smiled slowly. That was impressive. For the first time in her life, Vixara didn't feel shame about her size or strength. Instead, a fierce pride surged through her, her differences had protected someone she cared for. They reported the incident upon returning to the settlement, but both knew the tensions were escalating. That night, in the privacy of Marcus's quarters where he had insisted she stay for safety, they spoke in low voices about the future, both immediate and distant. When his fingers entwined with hers and his lips finally met hers in a gentle, questioning kiss, Vixara stopped thinking about differences in height or species or culture. For once in her life, she felt perfectly, exactly right. The human delegation's departure loomed just 3 days away. Vixara stood at the viewport of the orbital station, watching the Laris rotate slowly beneath her. Golden continents swirled with turquoise oceans that she had never visited. From this distance, the planet looked peaceful, beautiful even. It revealed nothing of the turmoil that had marked the past week. After the attack at the monitoring station, security measures had been increased around both Vixara and the human visitors. An extremist faction had emerged, using their relationship as a rallying point against off-world influence. Meanwhile, the more progressive Thelorisians had begun to question the rigid cultural structures that had marginalized Vixara her entire life. "There you are," Marcus's voice came from behind her. He joined her at the viewport, his hand finding hers with familiar ease. "The shuttle's ready whenever you are." The Council had granted special permission for Vixara to accompany Marcus to the orbital station, ostensibly to assist with final calibrations to the atmospheric monitoring systems the humans were leaving behind, but everyone understood the true purpose of their visit. They needed privacy for the conversation they had been delaying. "I've been thinking about what you said," Vixara began, her eyes still fixed on the planet below. "About doorways I wouldn't have to duck through." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "Earth would welcome you. The Scientific Council was impressed by your atmospheric regulation designs. They've already approved a position for you if you want it." "And us?" she asked, finally turning to face him. "What would we be on your world?" "Whatever we choose to be," he answered. "Earth has no nutritional bonding rituals to accidentally trigger." His smile faded into seriousness. "But I know what I hope we could become, given time." Vixara's crest rippled with emotion. 3 months ago, she couldn't have imagined anyone looking at her the way Marcus did, with admiration, affection, and complete acceptance of every inch of her 8-foot frame. "Commander Whitfield received a message from the High Council this morning," she said. "They've created a new position, Interplanetary Ambassador to Earth. They've nominated me." Marcus's eyes widened. "That's unexpected. Apparently, my unique perspective and demonstrated ability to bridge cultural differences makes me an ideal candidate." She couldn't keep the irony from her voice. "The same differences they've always shunned are suddenly diplomatic assets. Will you accept?" Vixara gazed back at the Laris. "This planet has never been truly home. I've spent my life trying to be smaller, less noticeable, less myself." She turned to him, her crest fully extended with newfound confidence. "I'm tired of making myself less. I want to be more, to discover who I am when I'm not constantly apologizing for existing." Marcus stepped closer. Despite the significant difference in their heights, they had discovered a harmony in their movements, a way of being together that felt natural and right. "Then come to Earth," he said. "Not just as an ambassador, but as yourself, however you choose to define that." Later, in the station's observation dome, they created their own ceremony. There were no official witnesses, no formal declarations, just the two of them, the stars, and the promises they made. Marcus had brought 2 items from Earth, simple bands of metal that he explained were traditional symbols of commitment in many Earth cultures. Vixara had created small woven crowns from filaments shed from her crest, explaining that in the fragments of Azuran culture she had discovered, such gifts symbolized the intertwining of paths. On Earth, Marcus said as he slipped the band onto her long, azure finger, "We say that love doesn't care about boundaries, not of nations, species, or expectations." "From what I've learned of my ancestors," Vixara responded, carefully placing the woven crown on his head, "they believed that differences in form were merely variations in how the universe expressed itself." When they kissed, Vixara no longer worried about having to bend down or about appearing awkward. They had found their own balance. The next day, as the Earth vessel prepared for departure, the docking bay filled with an unexpected crowd. Dozens of Thelorisians had come to witness the farewell, some out of curiosity, others in genuine support. Among them stood several young Thelorisians who had begun proudly displaying their full crest height rather than the traditionally restrained posture. Chief Counselor Neville approached, her formal robes indicating the official nature of her presence. Ambassador Vixara, your credentials and diplomatic documentation. She handed over an intricately designed case. The Council expects regular reports on Earth customs and scientific advances. Of course, Counselor, Vixara replied, accepting the case with proper formality. Neville hesitated, then added more quietly, there was much debate about your appointment. But those of us who prevailed believe that perhaps the Laris has been diminished by our insistence on sameness. Your journey may help us all stand taller. As the boarding announcement echoed through the bay, Vixara took one last look at the planet that had never accepted her. She would return someday, but not as the outsider desperately seeking belonging. She would return as Ambassador Vixara, representing Earth's interests, and as herself, finally embracing the full measure of who she was meant to be. Marcus took her hand as they walked toward the ship that would carry them to his world, a place where she would still be different, but where difference was not something to minimize or apologize for. Ready? He asked, smiling up at her. Vixara straightened to her full, magnificent height and nodded. For the first time in my life, completely. Together they stepped through the doorway into the ship, a doorway that, Vixara noticed with quiet joy, she didn't have to duck to pass through. Marcus had been right. Some places were built with room enough for everyone, no matter their shape or size. As the stars streaked past the viewport and the Laris faded from view, Vixara felt not grief but anticipation. The universe was vast and full of differences. She and Marcus were simply one more beautiful variation in its endless pattern.